Welcome to the What in the World is the West End? We'll be starting in just a couple of minutes.
I'm trying to look at some names, see if anybody was here this morning for Jason Fortner's class. It's quite the theater day.
Yes, I think this will be a good addition to what we saw this morning.
Yeah, it's almost like Jason planned it, just alluding to the West End, talking a little bit about it. Oh, Russ was there this morning for Jason. Now, Russ, were you already planning to come to this class, or did you decide after Jason's class to join this one as well? I still see people coming to the room.
It looks like we've got a good number so far. Welcome everybody to What in the World is the West End, Part 1.
We'll give it just one more minute, then we'll start the opening announcements. All right, I think we probably can get started with the announcements, Jean.
Okay. Welcome. Today you're going to be seeing What in the World is the West End, Part 1 with Jessica Thonen. And Jessica, we have about 30 participants today. To those of you that are out there, our participants, I think most of you have seen this before. The best connection is if you have a hardwire connection to your router. If you are using a wireless connection, try to be as close to your router as possible and turn off the wireless on all devices you're not using. If you're having audio or video problems, it's usually fixed by just leaving the room and then coming back in. It should be working. If you have any questions though on the technical end, please use the chat and Conrad will be happy to help you. If you have questions for Jessica, use the Q&A, type your question in there, and we'll interrupt her at the appropriate time. And if you want to ask her a question live, just raise your hand and we will call on you. You'll have to unmute yourself, but we'll call on you. This program is being recorded so that you can watch it for the next few days. And with that, I think we're ready to turn it over to Jessica. I will tell you, Jessica is a member of the staff at Eckerd. She was telling us she's been there for 15 years now. So we'll let you take it over, Jessica. We're all anxious to hear about the West End.
Great, thank you. I think there was one raised hand already.
Yes, actually, I think it's about something else. I'm going to address that in the chat.
Fantastic. I just want to make sure. I love your questions, so I got very excited to see a raised hand. As Jean said, yes, I teach at Eckerd College. This is my 15th year. Before teaching at Eckerd College, I toured with a show, with a national tour, and worked in multiple different theater venues and have just collected so many different friends in the business. And I love it when I visit New York in particular, and now a little bit in London, when I go to visit friends, because it means that we're going backstage of whatever Broadway show they're in, which is really exciting. Today, we'll talk a little bit about what the different types of theater are and how we talk about them, and also go through a little bit of the history of the West End and talk about how it got established, where it is, and what it means to be a show in the West End. There's so many different types of professional theater out there. Really for today, we're not talking a good bit about community theater or regional theater, but we're really talking about shows that hit either in New York or specifically in London. So we talk about a little bit about Broadway, off-Broadway, off-Broadway, and of course the West End. And these get discussed repeatedly, and sometimes there can be a little confusion for some enthusiasts to sort out the differences between the four. So I thought we could start with a little conversation about that. In order to be called a Broadway theater, you have to have at least 500 seats in your theater. Now, any good Broadway producer who knows the business wants a lot more than 500 seats in their theater, because that means more revenue in the long term. But what they don't realize is that just the seat, it's the seat requirement and then also some budget requirements and some union contract requirements as well. And all of this means that a lot of the theaters that are Broadway theaters aren't actually close to Broadway at all. If you think about something like Lincoln Center, if you've been to New York and attended something there, it's quite a large distance from that central theater district, but still a Broadway theater house. Off-Broadway will be just one step down, though they don't like to think about it that way. They like to think about it as sideways from Broadway theater. These houses will have anywhere between 499 seats, back to that seat number again, and it'll refer to the types of contracts in the budget as well. And you'll see some shows move from off-Broadway or even off-Broadway to sort of the main stage, the Great White Way of Broadway. Off-Broadway developed, though, because there was this burgeoning theater scene, especially through the 1960s, that wanted to embrace the experimental nature and the avant-garde works that were happening mostly downtown. So they sort of created this new term of something that was usually downtown, though not always, and that was just a little bit more outside of the normal realm. So you can think about a show like Hedwig and the Angry Inch that starts off-Broadway, and then eventually, surprisingly, made a move to Broadway quite successfully. Today and next week, we'll talk a great deal about the question of what is global theater today. Well, I mean, these days, plays and musicals are really only created with a global and somewhat corporate distribution in mind, partly because they've come to rely so heavily on this large technical package that goes along with it. I mean, if you buy a ticket for a Broadway play or a West End play, you really do expect to see some high flash on that stage. And that all takes a little bit of coin to make it happen. And so we start to see the development of the mega musical within this idea of the global theater phenomenon. And we start to see that shows are really moving not only back and forth between countries, but they're originating in different places. West End and Broadway are very similar, though. In fact, there's a strong inclination to say West End theater is the same as Broadway theater. But when you think about the West End, it has its different set of rules. Now, the two are very similar. The big difference, the big obvious difference, of course, is Broadway's in New York City and the West End is London. The thing about the West End, though, is that it's really referring to a specific part of London, right? The west side of London. And many large theaters are residing there and grew out of the development of the city, particularly in the Victorian period, though we do have to go all the way back to the Restoration period, which I'll get to in a moment. But West End is the term that's most often used to define those highest echelons of great theater in Britain. Just as Broadway represents the mainstream professional theater in the large houses of New York City, all within a certain proximity typically, the West End is this area of London where their Broadway caliber shows are staged. If a show opens on Broadway and it's advertised that it was a West End hit, that means that it played London's West End first before making its voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to open into a Broadway house. And there's this wonderful sort of sense of exchanged love that happens across the two countries. Conrad, could you actually put the first poll up for me? It's going to
Sure.
ask you which of the following shows did not get its start in the West End before coming to Broadway. So you've got some options there. I'll give you a hint. There's actually 2 there, but see if you can find at least one that did not get its start on the West End before coming to Broadway. There's this lovely thing that happens where the artists who are in the United States, once they hit Broadway, they wonder, well, what's the next step? What's the next step? And the next step is London, right? And if you're starting off in London, it's much the same. In fact, so much so that the first time I taught at Eckerd's London Study Center in London, I was meeting with our theater faculty member in London, and she said, well, what is the deal? Why do so many Americans want to even come to London? We want to go that way. And I had a hard time explaining to her that it's a little bit of that grass is greener, hoping to achieve just one more thing before you sort of close up shop or move on to your next idea. Okay, last couple of chances. Let's see. I see one person maybe saying My Fair Lady, one person saying Groundhog Day, a large group saying Hamilton. Maybe I made it too easy. One saying Cats, and one for Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end this poll and give you your answers. I think we can share the results.
Okay,
so
got
you'll
it. There
see
you go.
that. Yep. The answers, got to find them here in mine. So Hamilton is correct. Yes, that's absolutely correct. The other one that opened first on Broadway, not in the West End, is My Fair Lady. Right, so I'll stop sharing that so we can see. So it can be surprising, I think, especially when you look at the content, and it would seem like something like My Fair Lady would certainly open up in London, but it's not what the audiences in London were excited about at the time. And it had a better chance of taking purchase with American audiences. So they opened it there and then, of course, moved it later. I want to show you this map that I have, if you can stand it, staring at a map for a little bit. So this is what we call Theaterland. West End is also known as Theaterland. And I think it's such a charming way to talk about the area. I was sitting at a show, Matthew Bourne's Red Shoes at Sadler's Wells last January. And the gentleman next to me, we were chatting during there were 2 intermissions, which shocked my students to find out there were 2 intermissions. But we were chatting, he said, oh, we just love living in Theaterland. And I just thought, what a charming way to refer to your own neighborhood. Is Theaterland. So great. If you ever go to London, and I'm sure Mary would want me to remind you that we are planning a trip to go to London and sort of take this question of what does it mean to do and see theater in the West End. We're planning on taking that question directly to London on a future date. And I know everything's just vaguely on a future date right now, but we will get there, I feel certain. If you look at this map, if you've been to London, so here's the British Museum right here. The Eckerd Study Center is just right here. It's just amazing for anyone who loves theater. And particularly the West End. And then there's a hotel we often stay at, and it's just right here. So close, so very close. So you might not even be able to see just right here. So if you were wanting to see something in Theaterland or West End, you could just walk down to any one of the 6 districts, or you can grab a tube and shorten your walking distance a little bit. And each of these 6 districts, it's really so lovely because each of them seems to have sort of a circle or a cluster of theaters around it, so that when you go to St. Martin's Lane here, you'll hit a specific set of theaters there, or you can consider the theaters that are on Charing Cross. Shaftesbury Avenue is a great area as well. which continues down through here. But if you walk, you just simply walk down from the hotel or the Eckerd Study Center, you just walk down Shaftesbury Avenue. And then right there, we were seeing Anne Juliet, which was just this fantastic show that was up last winter. And then of course you've got Covent Garden and the Strand and Covent Garden North that you can see. And these areas are just steeped in history, and they're a very fashionable area for theater fans to catch the latest shows or maybe to splurge on a little shopping spree.
Are you ready for your first two questions?
Great, let's hear them, yeah.
Okay, they're both from Joseph. We'll start first. How many theaters are there in the West End versus Broadway?
It's pretty comparable. I don't have a number for you, I'm sad to say, but I'm going to write the question down so next week I can come back to it. How many theaters? But they're pretty comparable. The difference, though, is really how they're supported. So that with our Broadway houses, they're typically privately owned, privately funded, whereas in London, you see a lot more either support from the Crown or support from the government to both maintain the historic nature of those buildings, but also to support the work that's being done within them. I'm sorry, Joe, I've let you down, but I've written it for next time.
And then he has one other question. Is it true that ticket prices in the West End are cheaper than Broadway?
It's true, which is why that's where I saw Hamilton. I didn't see it in the States. I saw it in London, which was fascinating because you might imagine, if you know the musical, that an English audience would want just a couple of changes to the way some of that looks. So for example, the battle scene at York, actually, if you watch the Disney Plus version, they use the London battle scene at York, right? They made the battle scene at York in London, they take down some of the murderous choreography, right? And the sort of celebration of death during the battle at Yorktown. Understandably so, right? Because the people being killed victoriously by the revolutionists are English. And so that would just be, everyone takes the whole show in stride and the audience and quite enjoys it, but it was a good change for London, and Disney Plus decided to make it a little bit more family friendly to keep that change in the broadcast version. So I was really excited. I mean, tickets are still expensive, but they are much cheaper than what you can get in Broadway, especially if you know some of the lingo for getting the same day tickets and standing in line for the box office. I saw a number of things that were just phenomenal for £10 because I showed up at the box office first thing when it opened. So there's, whether you're planning ahead or taking advantage of those same day tickets, we call them rush, they call them day tickets, then you really do have an opportunity to see a lot of shows for much less than here. Any other questions before I move on?
Yes, Jessica, you have two more questions. One is the Apple Store in that district?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know where the Apple Store is. I would imagine it's either on Oxford Street up here in that area, or that it would be down in Charing Cross or near Piccadilly Circus. I mean, those, or even Regent Street. That's where I would be walking to find an Apple Store, because those are the types of stores you would find down there. Sort of the, if you want to say high end, I think you can call Apple high end. Some of the high end stores are in that area.
And then the next question is by Russ. It's Broadway uses seat count to classify Broadway. What is the criteria for being a West End theater?
Yeah, for a West End theater, seat count is going to come into it. Budget is going to come into it as well, because there's an expectation for the quality on stage. They're also going to look at who the patrons are that are supporting it, right? Like whether there's someone of some level of nobility that's connected to it, right? And what kind of licensure they have. I am encouraged with the question about the Mac store, because it sounds like you're already planning to join the trip in the spring or maybe summer if you're planning a shopping trip. So that's excellent. I'm going to move on to show you something that's a little bit mean, it's still in Theaterland because it would be in Covent Garden, and it's part of the rich history of theater in the area, but maybe a surprise to include. But this is the Punch and Judy show. Now, the Punch and Judy show is a puppet show. It was this traditional glove puppet, though sometimes a rod puppet, if you want to get into the nitty gritty of puppets. I also specialize in puppetry, so we do get to the nitty gritty in my classes, but sort of the traditional hand glove puppet with these stock characters that are thought to be to come from Commedia dell'arte, actually. But this is one of the very first shows in the areas in that restoration period, right in Covent Garden. And they celebrate the birthday every year. May 9th, 1662 is the date that they record as the birthday for Punch. And they're really lovable puppets. Now, it can be a little bit controversial now to have these puppets because the stock characters don't always have the most polite and, I don't know, forward thinking sort of philosophies, but it's thought that it's founded in Pulcinello, who obviously comes from Italy, is a Commedia dell'arte stock character. And Punch and Judy is this traditional puppet show that features Mr. Punch right here, and whoever plays Mr. Punch, the puppeteer, has a swizzle, which is like a folded reed that sticks in their mouth and kind of sounds part kazoo and part whistle, and that's how Punch talks. And then there's his wife Judy, and of course their baby is often involved. These archetypal yet controversial figures are well loved in Britain, but it is some think it's sort of glorifying domestic violence in the tradition, but I think most people nod to kind of the charismatic love of this 16th century Italian puppet, Pulcinella. And I think that this is a great example of really how far you have to go to understand how the West End became the West End. Pulcinella from the Restoration period, and really when we think about theater in the West End, we have to start at that Restoration period where so many things were coming over from Italy. Why? Well, because this guy, Charles II, got kicked out of England, right? His father as well. His father had a tougher time of it because he was, well, he was killed in order to dethrone him. And there was a period of interregnum. During the interregnum, Charles II and all of his family fled to part of the time Italy, where they were protected by the Pope, and part of the time in France. The interregnum is such an interesting period because we had two monarchs in France, and there were all these rules that followed because you can't have, apparently, two monarchs in the room at one time. So there were lots of social ins and outs that had to be coordinated. But the interesting thing for theater at the time is that you have to remember Charles II is in Italy for most of it. And Italy during the interregnum is having this flourishing and this blossoming of the arts all around, but especially in theater, where they are developing all of these machines and these giant theaters that could do things that people had never seen before, right? Raising people up with different mechanisms and making things appear on stage that seem to lower from the heavens and having lights rise out of the ground. And just a reminder, those lights are candles. And yes, it's coming between blades of wood, but miraculously they had it all managed. It was so well managed that they even had this whole room upstage of the theater, not dressing rooms, no, a house for all of those special effects. So while the interregnum is going on, Charles II is there and he's seeing all of that. That's something to stow away for a moment. But during the interregnum, this is what's happening in London. And I have to say, for someone like me, who likes a little bit of drama and a little bit of flash, this would not have been my favorite time in England. There was a group of people who were very strict about religious law and order. Particularly, they would be called by the name, which was not particularly nice at the time, but I think you'll forgive me if I say it. They were called Roundheads. I know, I'm sorry, I won't say it again. And these people were really ruling at the time, and they were taking away anything that was not necessary or qualified for daily life or for spiritual flourishing. This meant, you probably predicted it, theaters were shuttered. So in times like this, when theater is shuttered all across the globe, I like to be reminded of interregnum and of the plague, and also of the tail end of ancient Rome, times when theater was shuttered again and again. But we come to life. We will get back to the theater again. And it happened in England as well, because at some point, Charles II comes back, right? And he is restored to the throne, creating the name of this period, the Restoration period, starting in 1660. Now, the first time I ever started thinking about where West End began, I called my friend, Natasha Dodsworth in London. She also teaches at a college there. And I said, Tash, do you really think I have to go all the way to the Restoration period to understand the West End? And she said, listen, I'm sorry, your country is so young that you only have to go back 100 years, but we just have been here that long. I said, okay. We'll go back to the 1660s. So here we are in the Restoration period. When I teach the Restoration period to my students here at Eckerd, I like to talk to them about it as a period in response to being ruled by a more prudish folk, right? And I think you can see it pretty clearly in the fashion of the time, so that you can see if anything were to stand still on the body, it was covered with a ruffle or a bow or an extra bit of satin to the nth degree. Of course, a good reminder when you're looking at historic fashion, we are looking at the upper echelons of society. This is not the way you would dress if you were tending to a house or tending to nobility in your home. But this is what people aspire to, which is exciting to see. So you get a sense that during this Restoration period, there was really no ceiling for what was acceptable. And it went the same way on stage, so that people would write these plays that would consider content that we would probably find fairly salacious even now. I can remember the first time reading it and looking at my professor and going, are you kidding? Are we really going to talk about this right now in front of each other? Because it can sometimes be that intense, the subject matter, but people were so ready to just open all the gates and have everything be available for discussion and silliness and delight. And so that's where we end up in the Restoration period. And it takes a little bit of time to build a theater, but we do get to the first theater, one of the oldest theaters existing in the West End, which is Theatre Royal, Drury Lane. So Theatre Royal, Drury Lane was first built on the orders of a Restoration era dramatist and theater manager, Thomas Killigrew. And this is the West End's oldest theater, and it received the first royal patent. So remember, every patent that had ever been given during the Elizabethan period, any sort of rule that was followed to offer sponsorship to a theater company was stripped away during the interregnum. Nothing was funded, nothing was supported. Now, you and I both know that theater people will find a way to still entertain themselves. So there were a couple workarounds, but when you're talking about getting all walks of people, and certainly the upper echelons, into a theater, you needed to have some permission. And particularly if you wanted to produce any of the most popular plays, which at the time would be the ones that were freshly written, which were all plays, not musicals or accompanied by music, or if you wanted to do Shakespeare, you needed a royal patent from Lord Chamberlain. And so Thomas Killigrew was able to secure that, our first one. This was originally known as Theatre Royal in Bridges Street. And it's one of the more beloved when you talk about the Restoration period, because scandalously, and who doesn't love a scandal, King Charles II's mistress, Nell Gwynn, was very famous for performing here in this theater. Today, the building is owned by Andrew Lloyd Webber, and it's actually one of these stories where we've not ripped a show off the stage due to COVID because it was in the middle of a beautiful restoration. So the theater closed naturally in 2019. The last show to perform there was 42nd Street. If you know the show, I'm sure you can hear the tapping in your head along with me. And at that time, in 2019, Drury Lane jumped into one of the most ambitious projects to date, a 60 million pound refurbishment project. So 60 million pounds, you can think about how much that would be when the pound typically trades for about $1.30, $1.20, quite a bit more. A large project to restore this historic theater, but how important to restore, how wonderful to restore the theater that really starts it all. And one thing to notice is in this restoration style theater, right in the restoration period, they start to develop what we often take for granted, which is this horseshoe shape of the audience, which really creates a larger number of people who can get into the space. And additionally, creates better sight lines for those that are involved in viewing it. Not for these people in the boxes, but if you're in a box, you're not really there to see the show, are you? You're there to be seeing the show. The important thing to point out when we talk about restoration theaters is that this actually isn't a restoration theater. It's a restoration playhouse. In England was the only country to have them. The rest of Europe was enjoying all of the advances that were made in France, from the parterre or the old tennis court style theaters into the horseshoe shape. But remember all of those machines that they had, that meant that this little part of the stage, which we call the apron, would have gone all the way out to here, so that there could just, all of the machines would stay upstage of this sort of wall here that we call the proscenium opening. So everything back this way would be machines coming in and out and up and down, and all the action would happen here. But the British audience was not having any of that. They came to know theater and love theater from sites like the Globe, where you could get as close to the action as actually leaning on the front of the stage. And so they wanted to have a much shallower apron where they could put the seating much closer to the person, to the farthest person who was actually doing the acting on the stage. So we see a very specific but important distinction between the restoration theaters and the restoration playhouses. If you're curious, the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, it's being restored to its 1812 glory. I know. I said it was a restoration playhouse. Why wouldn't they restore it to there? But in the Victorian period, as we'll get to, everything came to be a little bit more polished, a little bit more mechanized. And so it tends to be the desire to restore it to there. Right now, the plan is to reopen for 2021, and they will reopen for Frozen. When we were in London last January, a friend was telling me that they're reopening with Frozen. Why? I don't know. I felt a little bit betrayed that a beloved Disney musical would be there, but Frozen really is a beautiful spectacle that will fit in so well in that space. So if we think about the restoration period, other than the shape of the theater, we also have a little bit different seating plan that's happening, and this exists still today. And we're not looking at the Theatre Drury Lane anymore. We're looking at the Albury Theatre, which is actually built in 1903. Now it's known as the Noel Coward Theatre, but it gives us a chance to look at the way that they itemize their audience a little bit differently, and we can talk about why as well. You see, this bottom section that we would call the orchestra In England, they call it the stalls, right? And this upper area, the lower dress circle or royal circle, we might call the mezzanine, right? And then you would go up to either an upper mezzanine or a balcony and a second balcony. Most theaters will either have 2 sections, which would be the stalls and the dress circle, or 3 sections, which would be the stalls, the lower dress circle or royal circle, and you can imagine where that name comes from, and then the upper dress circle or grand circle. Very few theaters will have a balcony even higher up. And if you do go to a theater that has a balcony, I would just say take warning, especially if you're at the Royal Opera House. I once saw a show up there and it was quite dizzying, literally, to get up to my seat. You feel like you're going to pitch forward into the down into the stalls at any moment, and it's very high up. So high up that in front of me, attached to the seat in front of me, was a pair of binoculars provided for me to view the stage. It was a fantastic show though, so I didn't mind. So something to remember when you go to London and you go to get a ticket is that that best section is going to be in the stalls. These will be the most expensive. Then we go from the dress circle up. Now the reason why they went into the dress circle is because the audience didn't really act the way that we tend to act in the audience these days. In fact, not until Wagner's creation of his amazing operas and introduction of all these new ideas, like turning off the lights in the seating area in the house and pausing for in between the sections of the music without expecting applause, and really training an audience to act a certain way, it was quite a wild thing to be at the theater. So down in the stalls down here, generally, it was not respectable for a woman to be down there. And so typically, the most noble women would be seated here in the dress circle, and the royal circle being for the most noble women, and then the grand circle for the rest of the women who could afford a ticket to see the theater after that. But all of these people sitting here would not be sitting quietly with their hands folded in their lap. They would want to make some attention of themselves so that they could be seen in their most elegant finery. And also they're talking across the audience to each other. And if there was a woman down in the stalls, it tended to be someone of ill repute who was actually working at the time and hoping to sort of purloin maybe a nobleman away from his wife. I'm sorry to bring it up, but that is what happened down there. Now, if you want to, notice how I walk away from this point quickly, if you want to see a well-restored restoration playhouse, you still can. You can go to the Royal Opera House in London. And whenever I take students there, we always do an amazing backstage tour, which usually includes seeing a little sample of their Royal Ballet Company that's in-house in some type of practice, which is just unbelievable. But in the Royal Opera House, you can see a well-preserved example of the Restoration Playhouse. The current building, and again, not restored to that Victorian nature, but restored to the Restoration style playhouse. The current building on site is actually the third one that was erected on the site. But every effort has been made to preserve the history of the space, and it really remains as a great example. The third one erected on the site because the theater has suffered in its history 2 separate large-scale fires, one of which, when it burnt down, took with it Handel's own organ and many original manuscripts, which is a little sad, but this is sort of what happens when you put things in that realm of possibility where things can go up like tinder so quickly. I'm about to move on to the Victorian period and a little bit more about the geography of the West End. If there's any questions, I'd want to take those now.
I don't see any questions quite
Great.
yet, but if anybody has one, you can click Q&A on your Zoom toolbar. You can go ahead and leave it in chat too, or click raise hand and be prepared to unmute your mic. But I would say continue on.
Great. So by 1800, we're jumping now from late 1600s to 1800. By 1800, there really weren't enough theaters in London. The population was growing explosively, and the existing theater spaces were under a huge strain. And at the time, now remember, it's all the way in the 1800s, but we still only have 2 winter theaters, Covent Garden and Drury Lane. Covent Garden being the original name for the Royal Opera House. So Theatre Royal in Covent Garden and Theatre Royal Drury Lane are the only ones holding on to these licenses. And so there's this dramatic duopoly that's granted all through the 17th century and the 18th century. But theater confined to these 2 massive buildings was no longer enough for the world's largest city. In the early years of the century, the modern West End started to emerge, right? And so with that population there, they started saying, really, we need more opportunities to entertain ourselves, or having a little bit more leisure time on top of that. So Lord Chamberlain's office decided to partially break up the duopoly. And they did this by allowing a few Burletta licenses. So the Burletta licenses allowed permission to do plays with music. And this is really where things get off to an exciting start. So small theaters all along the Strand, like Jane Scott's San Perel, later to become the Adelphi, start to pop up. And so we see theaters like the San Perel here get built and develop, and it's a much smaller theater. San Perel was built by John Scott. He invested £10,000 and bought the leases of all the properties located at the side and in the rear of his dwelling house. So he did this really smart thing where he said, okay, I have this dwelling house where I live. If I buy the property over there, and anything behind me with these £10,000, then I would have enough space to build a small theater. So if you look at the scale of the people in here, you can get a sense for a much smaller theater that's being built, but it served everyone quite well. Waitress was originally there in March, but Waitress has a really lovely story and had a great opportunity because they had planned to close at the 1st of March 2020. And so they got to close and have all their wonderful closing night parties and say goodbye to each other and have those final hugs before everything got shuttered, as we know, mid-March of 2020. And so we see the Adelphi there now, where the San Perel used to be. And it's just such a nice story, like a lovely little COVID story for the Adelphi, because in addition to having the Waitress there and having quite an easy way to say goodbye and not feel a sense of loss, there's also this great story of opportunity that followed behind it. So there's a musical called Back to the Future, if you can believe it. And that was running in sort of an out-of-town run. An out-of-town run would be someplace where it's a little bit cheaper to do a show as far as property costs and locations and some of the sort of tangential costs of producing a show. And that was Manchester at the time. So they were running Back to the Future in Manchester, and it was doing quite well. Now, it got surprisingly shuttered due to COVID, but while it was closed, the producers went, the Adelphi's open. You're doing quite well. Why don't we just take this time to think about how to move Back to the Future to the West End? And so they're having this nice opportunity that's coming up for them, and they'll open in 2021 with Back to the Future, the musical, which I actually would like to see. I wouldn't think I would, but it looks exciting. So back to the Victorian period. Ironically, the very restrictions that disallowed the new theaters to do Shakespeare or other straight plays, well, that's what probably inspired the brilliant ingenuity and the inventiveness of entertainment at this time that also led us towards the West End musical as we know it. There were unlicensed premises as well. And they found a workaround. Remember, I had mentioned a workaround that if they did a silent sort of mimed play, which became the Victorian pantomime, something that was musically accompanied in its action, or something that relied on physical theater, or even one of my favorites, they had this great throng of shows that involved animals and acrobatics. All of these came to be great practice for the Victorian period. Because they weren't allowed to do straight plays, they started getting inventive on what they would produce. And through all of that, the musically accompanied action, the physical theater aspect of it, the silent nature of the pantomime, they developed a new area of theater that we know as melodrama. So melodrama and the Victorian pantomime are developed out of that. And without poetry from Shakespeare, or even that declamation that was happening at the time, they found that in addition to the entertainment they were providing on stage, there was much more needed from scenery and from visual effects. And these were also so very essential in major theaters. Excitingly enough, the timing was perfect for the Victorian period to think about lighting and auditorium design, and it made it easier to see the players. And audiences in the first half of the century, you remember, were not passive or still. In fact, for a lot of these Victorian shows, even still, the night was very long. Sometimes the show was 5 hours long. And they had this practice of putting several different pieces on offer to make a 5-hour show. But about midway through the show, they would invite people to come in for half price. So you would see this extra influx of people coming in, people who'd probably waited at the pub, drinking at the pub before they came in for the half price offering, and they would need to be instantly involved in the event. So it would become even more ruckus. This meant that those creating Victorian theater said, okay, I see what's happening here. We've got a lively audience. They're awfully pepped up for the second half, so we just need to be more. We need to be more spectacular, and visual style really took over from the static 18th century emphasis on the spoken word. Everything became about spectacle, this stylized spectacle that would be put on stage. In fact, individual actors would develop a style that combined gesture and movement and speech, as well as the accompanying music of the song. Almost sounds like choreographed dancing, doesn't it? And they did all this to make their points on stage larger and more visually exciting. And we developed new celebrities for the time period, like Sarah Siddons and Edmund Kean, T.P. Cook, who was the first monster of Frankenstein. And then at the beginning of the century, we see Henry Irving all the way through to the end. They were all known for their thrilling ability. Now think about this, their ability to command the attention of 3,000 people with just their slightest move, by gaslight, sometimes wordlessly. But that's phenomenal. That's true acting prowess, if you ask me. So then in 1843, propelled by this Victorian urge to sort of control and educate the new urban masses, Parliament decided to move along on their policies, and they finally changed the licensing laws. Yes, again. And now they started to permit all theaters to do straight plays. And when they made this change, they really were hoping that they would civilize the audiences, because this was the desire of those in nobility, was to sort of, as I said, control and educate the urban masses. So they thought, oh, no, they just need more Shakespeare in their lives. They need more sort of civilized entertainment, not this animals and acrobats business. And so they permitted all theaters to do the straight plays, hoping they would come back to more literate, modern playwriting. But the unexpected consequence was not more productions of Shakespeare or inspiring the new bards, but it was actually the growth of the West End. You know, people really took a love for what was happening on stage, especially with all these amazing actors captivating all their attentions. And so rather than switching over to simply creating more Shakespeare and more straight plays, what they did was they built more theaters and they allowed more unpredicted forms of entertainment. So rather than creating more venues for that sort of conventional conservative point of view, they said, oh, this is great. Now we can have our own theater to go wild in. So 2 old London playhouses, they're similarly dividing between highbrow and mass offerings. They become venues for 2 kinds of musical theater. And it still remains that way in a lot of ways with what once was the Royal Theatre at Covent Garden, but is now the Royal Opera House, where they're looking at the opera there, hence the Royal Opera House. They also house the Royal Ballet Company. And then for Theatre Royal Drury Lane, they remain dedicated to spectacular annual pantomime. And if you're ever in London for Christmas time, for those winter months of probably late November into December, to catch a traditional pantomime in the West End is an experience that we do not have in the States. I can assure you. And it's very exciting and fun to sort of step in and feel like a Brit for a moment. So they start doing the annual pantomimes at Drury Lane, and then they're also alternating with their melodramas that had already developed and remained reliant on some of the stunts and the spectacle, so that you would hear reports of a working paddle steamer on stage. Or why not? Let's put some real horse racing on stage as well. It's not so far from the breathtaking real scene dressing that can be deployed there today. I haven't seen real horses on stage, but if you think about a show like War Horse, you get a sense of that same type of spectacle where it almost feels like the horses are quite real, though you can see all of their machinery being activated. As Victorian technology, electric lighting, and hydraulics, all of it begins advancing, the scale and the excitement of the on-stage battles and the storms and the explosions and all of the transformations of the set on stage just grow and grow and grow and grow. And during that period, 2 theaters of note are developed, the Lyric and the Garrick theaters. Now, the Lyric Theater was actually the 2nd theater to be built in that district of Shaftesbury Avenue. It's now one of the oldest along Shaftesbury Avenue. And the Lyric Theater originally was staging light operettas when it first opened. When we were last there, I did not see a show there because what was there at the time, you know, they're known for staging kind of light dramas, light comedies and dramas, but at the time they were running Michael Jackson, the musical. And everyone seemed to be a bit confused, critics and audience members alike. Some people enjoyed it, but most people thought it was just odd to have it in the West End at all. It seemed like a show for years gone by. So when all of the theaters became shuttered in March, some called Michael Jackson closing almost like a mercy killing of COVID, that it was good that it went, it didn't quite fit, that it seemed to be from a time gone by that was not really meant to be relived. So that theater closed and they were looking for a new offering. And one of my all-time favorite musicals, which we'll talk about next time, which is just brand new in development, a great story of how history has treated women as it considers the 6 wives of Henry VIII in Six, the musical. It opens in just a little bit over a month, November 14th at the Lyric. It's an exciting opportunity, I think. The other theater we were talking about for 1889 is the Garrick Theater, and that's built in the same year. Here's the really cool thing about the Garrick Theater. When they're building the Garrick, they're really thinking about the way that the audience participates with the building. And I don't mean with the show, but how they enter and they exit and how they really engage with that building. So much so that they said, when we build this theater, we're not just building it plop on the ground. We're going to dig deep. All right, and let's make some deep excavations down into the ground so that the stalls of the theater, that what we would call the orchestra, actually sits below street level. It's the dress circle that's level with the street. And this was because they had the sense and the understanding that women going into the dress circle at the time were wearing the types of dresses that would be well, let's say they would appreciate not having to navigate stairs. And so they made that adjustment to really accommodate the fashions of the time and the fact that most women would be sitting in the dress circle. The interesting thing there is that when they started digging, they discovered a Roman river running through the land below, and they had to find a way to divert it. It's interesting as you think through the theaters of the West End, even through 2019, you'll hear these stories of foundations crumbling. 2019, it was the ceiling of one of the theaters fell on a patron's head, right? Some of these theaters are due for an update and gladly receive them, but you hear some of these stories of the foundations crumbling, and you think, well, that makes sense because it really was built sometimes on top of these Roman rivers. The city was just built up and up and up, and sometimes when they're building, they're not aware of what's below. And I think it's just such a lovely reminder of the great history of that little patch of land, that as you walk through London, especially if you get a chance to go through the British Museum, you see such great evidence of ancient Roman features that are all throughout the city, things that people hardly even notice sometimes as you pass through, because it's just that in touch with the history of humanity, certainly from a Western perspective. So the Garrick Theater is one of the West End's smallest theaters, so it's no wonder that they're not really planning a show until 2021, but they are starting with a show that was already in development. It's called The Drifter's Girl, with Beverly Knight, who anyone in London would get very excited about because she's a very well-known singer there, very soulful singer. And The Drifter's Girl is what we would call a jukebox musical, where they take a set of songs from a certain period of time and then they loosely stitch them together with a very, I think, often fragile narrative, but you don't ever care because it's such a party just to hear all of the songs together in one night. I often think between the Roman rivers and the history of the great fires all throughout London, it is a wonder that a theater even still exists, but they do. What I'm showing you here is moving into late 1940s, early 1950s. This is The Mousetrap. This was written by Agatha Christie. So in 1947, we get to see some of the support from the Crown for the art of theater when, in order to celebrate Queen Mary's 80th birthday, the BBC offered the Queen Consort a special broadcast of her choice. They said, whatever you like, Queen Mary, we'd like to give it to you for your 80th birthday. And they said, ever a populist, she asked for a new play by Agatha Christie. Unfortunately, the writer obliged. Originally, it was called Three Blind Mice, but her son came up with what she thought was a better idea, and I have to agree to name it The Mousetrap. So she turned a 30-minute radio drama into this full-length play. The Mousetrap is now the longest-running play of all time, and it's a legendary piece of theater history. Over 10 million people have seen The Mousetrap, and of course there's a tradition that no one reveals the murderer's identity, but it's just a great love, and it's got all these little touches. It originally opened at the Ambassadors Theater. It's in St. Martin's Lane district, and The Mousetrap then moved across the street to St. Martin's Theater, where you could see it now. And there's some interesting little things about it, like the late Derek Geiler, who died in 1999, is still a part of The Mousetrap, right? He's been a part of the Mousetrap since its first performance and continues because he offers his pre-recorded voice of the newsreader in the first act. And there's also one prop that has survived from opening night all the way through now, which is the clock above the fireplace in the main hall. Now, of course, they had to take the grand pause, as they all did in March, but they're planning to return quite soon at the end of October to continue this glorious run that they've had. I mean, so rare for a show to run so long and so consistently, but people get excited to go see it and participate in that long tradition. Now, right as the BBC was creating this great play for Queen Mother, or Queen Mary, Queen Consort at the time, now Queen Mother. There was another way that theater was being founded. So this is the building of the National Theater as it exists now. So the National Theater is really an icon on the South Bank. Inside of it, it has 3 theaters: the Olivier, named after, yes, exactly who you're thinking, Laurence Olivier, the Littleton, and the Dorfman, which we'll look at in a minute. These each opened separately in a period between 1976 and 1977, and the building is just this glorious, brutalist style of architecture. And I think I have a great love for this style of architecture, the same way I love our chapel on campus. And back before we had the new art building, the Ransom Arts building, they just had such bravery in design, the same way that the National Theater does. Benninger Theater has a bit of it too, but it's got French roots in its architectural style, but I digress. The National Theater has quickly become one of the most prestigious theaters for an actor to perform in England. So that there have been the likes of Peter O'Toole, Ian McKellen, Alan Rickman, Judi Dench, Derek Jacobi, all of them have been on one of the stages in the National Theater. And the very first talks of building the National Theater started in 1848. But it took quite a long time for the National Theater to officially open. It went through quite a series of ups and downs. So from 1848 to 1908, they worked on putting together a campaign. And even Charles Dickens was a notable supporter. And in 1908, they really pushed forward this plan to boost the theater's necessity and to explain to the government that we really needed to support a theater that would produce new plays, right? And specifically British plays for society of the time, and plays that would further the development of the modern drama, while also sort of protecting plays of great merit from falling into oblivion. So after many negotiations, a National Theater Act was finally passed in 1948. So remember, 1947 is when the BBC started putting money together to create Mousetrap for Queen Mary. And then it was in 1948, soon after that, that National Theater Act was passed, right? And the National Theater was finally received building permission. So then, why in 1951 did the government withdraw their support? Well, they said that the country just, quite frankly, couldn't afford the building. So the National Theater Company didn't quite take no as an answer there, obviously, because we're looking at a building that was built. We have to, before we finish the story of the National Theater, though, talk a little bit about the Old Vic. On the right-hand side of the screen, you're looking at one of the original illustrations of the Old Vic Theater and the way that it looked back in the day. And then on the left-hand side, obviously something more current. It's such a cool facade of a building. It certainly has that century, the feel of the period, but also merging with a modern sense. The Old Vic right there is actually painted on the building in that way, though it looks like a projection, especially at night when they light it up. And they've taken this very seriously to go forward with this neon in the front, which is just such an interesting visual juxtaposition between old and new. The Old Vic is this 1,000-seat theater in Lambeth. And so Lambeth is really an area that we have a lot of Cockneys and more sort of working people, right? And so the effort was to create the Royal Coburg Theatre in 1818 and to try to bring more shows to kind of the masses and people who might not make it all the way to West End to see a show. The Old Vic went through numerous name changes, as many theaters do. In 1833, it became the Royal Victoria Theatre. 1871, it became Royal Victoria Palace. And then in 1880, it was formally named the Royal Victoria Hall. But by that time, everyone just called it the Old Vic, right? The Old Victorian Hall, the Old Vic. And there was, remember in that Victorian period, the idea that we should offer the sort of urban folk a chance for civilized theater. And so in 1824, Emma Collins works really hard to bring Edmund Kean. If you recognize the name, you know he's like this amazing Shakespearean actor of the period, producing lots of Shakespearean plays, sometimes in a melodramatic fashion, but bringing Edmund Kean south of the river to play 6 Shakespearean plays in 6 nights, and talk about a different audience. The theater really, again, was trying to bring high art to the masses, and this effort was confirmed when Kean addressed the audience during the curtain call saying, "I have never acted to such a set of ignorant, unmitigated brutes as I see before me." It sounds like it was a very tough house and perhaps a tough relationship between the two. The whole theater had a little bit of trouble during the Blitz, but it comes back together and became in 1963, it dissolved its own company and the new National Theatre Company. There it is. We're back to the National Theatre. The new National Theatre Company, under the artistic direction of Sir Laurence Olivier, performs at the Old Vic. And they perform there for a good while until finally they open up that glorious National Theatre down on the South Bank in 1976. So they come and they slowly open these 3 different theaters in this whole complex. The first to be built was the Olivier Theatre. Now, the Olivier Theatre is the National Theatre's largest auditorium, and obviously named after its artistic director, Sir Laurence Olivier, who managed the company even before it had its own space. But the notable thing about the Olivier Theatre, you can see these 2 different views, is that there's quite an edge of a circle here. You can see it a little better here. They installed 2 different important pieces of technology: a drum revolve, which means that any scenery that's placed on stage can be rotated one of 2 ways. And last I saw a Comedy of Errors there, it was just fantastic because if you're familiar with the show, you know the twins are appearing and reappearing and intersecting without ever seeing each other on stage. So as the whole stage is moving around, the twins are just missing each other as they walk through all the scenery, and we get to see them happen into each other's, past each other's lives, quite often just missing each other. There's also a sky hook, which we can't see here, but it was a special piece of equipment that allowed sets and equipment to be easily brought in and out of its 3rd floor location, which was really convenient. Olivier Theatre made history with Guys and Dolls. Not only was it the nation's first musical, but Guys and Dolls led to a UK tour and a West End run. So it was a very exciting piece for the National Theatre. The second theater that they opened was the Littleton Theatre. Excuse me, and it opened with Hamlet, starring Albert Finney. It's the 2nd biggest performance space, but it is sometimes preferred to the Olivier because the backstage area can house so many more pieces of scenery. They don't have to go up to store it or to take it out. They can just go back into the sides, and so it can handle much more complex scene changes. And then the third one, of course, is the Dorfman. And the Dorfman in some ways is the most modern. It's built with a greater capacity with better sight lines and large foyer spaces. And it's really, in a lot of ways, just a rectangular room with excellent lighting, because the space can really be adapted for a variety of seating arrangements. It holds 450 people though, so not technically a West End space. Let me show you one other arrangement of the Dorfman Theater. So you can see here now, instead of having all of the seats here facing this direction, we've come more into what I like to refer to as tennis court style seating, where you can watch not only the action on stage, but the people on the other side. And you can see people almost like watching a tennis match, acting back and forth across this large space. It's an exciting way to see theater. So for the National Theater, they get their building up and running, and they've had since then numerous artistic directors working on plays and musicals and performances, and shows at the National Theater have won over 450 awards. And they've gone on to transfer, of course, to both the West End and to Broadway. Between the 1950s and the 70s, though, we see a really specific type of theater on stage in West End, right? So the previous 4 decades would be a bit difficult for theater to occur, of course, because we've got the world wars in there. But post-World War II, between those 1950s and 1970s, the West End really plays second fiddle to Broadway. And a lot of that is due to the fact that the whole country is trapped in this time warp of pre-war nostalgia, right? And it makes sense because they're a lot closer to the trauma of the time, and they have dealt with the Blitz in their own country. And in some ways, they're still walking through the rubble of what happened before. And so they were mentally and emotionally unprepared for a new breed of musical that was already emerging in America. But the 1970s proves to be the most radical evolution of the British musical yet. In fact, we become really poised for a transformation that begins with Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber. Conrad, will you put that second poll up?
Yep, give me a second.
Sure, thank you.
Jessica, while he's putting that up, you do have a question. It's what was happening at the Globe during the Victorian era?
Yeah, the Globe actually, it isn't very well around during the Victorian period. There are playhouses of the like, but if you go to the Globe when you're there, which if you go with me, we'll go to the Globe as part of the class. Depending on timing, we'll likely see a show there, which is exciting because it's under the stars and still open. But they'll explain to you that during the Elizabethan period, it actually burnt down. Who knew that live cannon fire and thatched roofs would not be a good mix? So that one went down really. And so we don't see any action there in the Victorian period for the proper Globe Theater. And even now, they believe they've found the original site for the Globe Theater. Where they've built this reconstruction of the Globe Theater is not the original site. I think if I remember correctly, they've built it where the Rose Theater actually was. Where the Globe Theater used to be is now a car park. And we do need places to park our cars, so that's fine. If you would like to go and celebrate, you can celebrate there. But the Globe Theater that exists in London in this time is a wonderful love affair of actually an American who said, this is a tragedy. How do we not have even a recreation of the Globe Theater in London on the South Bank? And so he went through, much like the National Theatre and all the people in 1908 did, during the late 80s, early 90s, he went through a great period of really rallying support across the globe to reconfigure the Globe Theatre. And even now, in the past 10 years, they've had this wonderful improvement where they have the Globe Theatre built to original specs, though on a different site. And just magical to be there. I can still remember my first time there going, oh, now I understand better, whether it was one scene from Romeo and Juliet or something that I kept reading in history about the way that the plays would perform there. I couldn't quite get it before I stood there and stared at it and felt sort of the connection to all of the history there. But in addition to the Globe Theater, in the past 10 years, they went through another building of support for recreations, and they created what's known as the Wanamaker. The Wanamaker was also from Shakespeare's time, but it was one of the few indoor theater spaces so that they could do indoor theater even during the winter. Because obviously theater during the winter in the Globe, it's entirely too dark. When I take classes there in January, by 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's getting dark, surprisingly. And so they couldn't start a play as early as they would need to be in the Globe. But the Wanamaker, they did it all by candlelight so that they could do plays even at night in winter in the Elizabethan period. And now, if you go during the winter to London and you want to see a Shakespearean play, or sometimes they do more classical plays that are non-Shakespearean, you can see one at the Wanamaker still by candlelight, if you can believe it. They have gone through the licensure and the safety protocols to allow for all of those live candles that stay lit through the whole performance. And it's really a magical experience. Okay, so most of you have voted here. Still have a little time if you like to. One of these musicals was the first musical by Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice. Which one is it that starts the radical evolution of the British musical? Or in other words, which one came first? Great, and I'll give you about 5 more seconds if you still want to vote. So that's 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And then I'll show you what we came up with. Most of you said Jesus Christ Superstar, and you would be correct, right? So Jesus Christ Superstar, even though it didn't open actually in London, it is the first one, and it starts this radical, I mean, supremely radical evolution, even in simply the way that we approach theater. But before we get to that point, let me introduce you to a couple of my friends. We've got, excuse me, Sir Timothy Miles Binden Rice and Sir Andrew Lloyd Webber, Baron Lloyd Webber of Sydmonton. So you can see them here in their various stages from very young when they first started working together. And I just love this picture of them with John Legend with their Emmy Awards for Jesus Christ Superstar just a couple years ago. So still making some great waves with that live TV special. We start with Tim Rice in some ways. He actually started his career singing with a pop group called the Aardvarks during his late teens. But then he said, you know what, time to grow up, as some of us do, and set aside his passion for music to go to law school. But in 1965, he was introduced to this gentleman, Andrew Lloyd Webber. And at the time, he says, you know, I know you're doing the law school thing, but I need a lyricist, and you sound like just the kind of guy. Now, Andrew Lloyd Webber had this huge background in musical. Tim Rice said, I don't know musicals. I know music, but I don't know musicals. And Andrew Lloyd Webber says, why don't you handle the music, and I'll deal with the musical side. And then this brilliant partnership began. One of the biggest and most notable transformations that they create is that with Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber, they create Jesus Christ Superstar. The first thing they do is not to stage a show, but rather to release an album. And those of you who know the show know that it fuses rock with opera, which at the time had people dropping their jaws. And they really hoped, they thought, let's release this album. And then if people fall in love with the album, we'll know that we can create a hit staged musical afterwards. And these two aspiring young songwriters, they each bring in their different qualities to the British musical. While both fans of rock music, Rice again, knew next to nothing about musical theater, but Lloyd Webber lived it and breathed it and knew just how to bring it to life. Now, they released the album in Britain. It doesn't go great, right? But when they release it in America, it is a #1 sensation very quickly. And so logically, they take this global mindset to say, why would we open this in England? Let's go to America. So they shoot to launch the show, which was based only very loosely on the Gospels account of the last weeks of Jesus's life, on Broadway first. It has a little bit of a shaky start on Broadway, but producer Robert Stigwood still made plans for an opening in the West End, and they allied this contemporary soundtrack with modern staging, and the musical Jesus Christ Superstar, starring Paul Nichols and Stephen Tate, opens in the West End in August 1972 to universally good reviews. The radical interpretation of the Gospels really moved the audience and the critics and even the cast in a lot of ways. And so we see this start of a new direction for musicals in general, taking this really global view about how they approach things. And then in addition, this idea to release an album before actually having a musical, right? And you can see this plan repeat itself multiple other times all through the history of musical theater. The next show that they create together is Evita, and you probably recognize Elaine Page there from the original production. In 1978, the British musical reaches this high watermark with the production of Evita. Now, remember, just before this, just before Jesus Christ Superstar, on stage, they're enjoying this pre-war nostalgia. They're sitting in melodrama. They're enjoying sort of the days gone by, sort of enjoying what was before they had the war. So this is really a radical shift for everyone. And I think of all the plays that Weber and Rice did together, the one that is most remarkable to me in its attraction through an unusual content is Evita. It's this real life story of a South American dictator's wife. And it features that memorable anthem, "Don't Cry for Me, Argentina." I will not sing it for you. I'll save you from that. But the show begins with Eva Perón's death, right? She's dying from cancer right in the beginning, but then we go straight through the whole musical as she charts her entire life through flashbacks. And Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber's collaboration helps bring the West End back into contention with Broadway. And this is really the late 70s where we see the two starting to vie for one another, so that we have it open on the West End. And then it also opens on Broadway, and it makes stars of both Elaine Page in the West End and Patti LuPone, who is really just at the beginning of making a name for herself on Broadway. The following year, Evita opens on Broadway for a 4-year run. So 1979, Evita opens on Broadway for a 4-year run. And this is massive for anyone who's watching trends in theaters, because it means that Lloyd Webber and Rice have been cemented not just as stars of the West End, right, with the second great musical in theaters in the West End, but also they are the first British talents to triumph in New York for 15 years, which is pretty remarkable if you think about that it had been such an American endeavor for 15 years going strong. And then we know after that it takes off. Evita ran for 7 years in the West End, proved to be one of the later ones, but the show ushers in an era for over a decade when Britain effortlessly dominated musical theater all over the world with international hits, right? So that all through the 80s, we keep seeing hit after hit coming from this Webber-Rice combo. We see Cats, we see Phantom of the Opera, Les Mis comes through, and Miss Saigon as well. All of them coming through again and again and again, just showing the real prowess of this couple together. Now, next week, when we're together, we'll start to talk about how the development of these musicals really leads to a new idea and a real global approach to developing musicals, and a specific type of musical called the mega musical. So next week, we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to leave just a little bit of time here at the end if there's any other last questions.
Yes, there is a question. If anybody has a question, go ahead and type it into the Q&A or raise your hand. Actually, it's more of a statement for you. Barbara looked up and said there are 39 theaters in the West End.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for this time?
We'll give them a moment to go ahead and type in their questions. Well, there's one from Jean. Jean, you got it, right?
Yeah, you're going to love this one. Joseph wants to know, when's our trip to London?
This is a great question. And if this were last March, I would tell you, oh, it's scheduled for April. But as we all know, things are a little bit in flux right now. So the original dates were planned for April, but we're looking at what might be the safest time for a transatlantic flight that lands us into London. So Mary and I are working on timing for that. And as soon as we feel like we have a concrete answer, we'll share it. And I hope you'll join us. It's one of my favorite things to do is to take people over to London and just share that glorious city with them. It's just so wonderful.
Can you explain a little bit about the program that Eckerd has over there? And we do have a couple raised hands, so while you're talking about that, I'll have them unmute their mics.
Okay, great. The let's see, Eckerd has a study center over in London, and it's in that Westminster district. You saw on the map where it is, and it's this house that they have 4 floors above, and then below the main floor is where there's a room for faculty and any family they bring, though it's quite small, and everyone lives together in that building and has meals together, and students take their normal course load while they're there. They'll take 1 or 2 from the Eckerd residential faculty member, like me or anyone else who's currently teaching on campus. And then they'll also take 2 or 3 others from faculty who are engaged across London to support the academic program there. So they could take a class with Jane Green, who teaches an amazing theater class there that I always want to take, or they can take any other number of sort of core courses. But one of the 4th courses that's required while they're over there is British Seminar, which really has them taking advantage of the location to learn a great deal about what it means to be a part of England and some of the history of England there, and taking in some of the sites. It's a little bit different academic calendar, because they built it so that there's really, instead of 1 spring break, there's sort of 2, and they're not optional for students to travel. They're required. Students are required to jump out and actually go visit somewhere else in the United Kingdom, and then come back and report on it and write essays on it, so that there really is this great opportunity to get really engrossed and participate in the life of the United Kingdom, which is really
Okay, we're going to go with Barry, Karen, then Joseph. Barry's question is, what is the name of the hotel near the Eckerd Center?
the Rosemount. The Rosemount
Okay.
is almost like bed and breakfast with, I mean, European rooms, so they're always tiny, but they have exactly what you need. And it's just the loveliest couple that runs the Rosemount. And every morning, British breakfast, a full British breakfast, which is my favorite part.
And
Besides the location.
Karen has her mic unmuted, so Karen, ask your question, please.
Thank you, Conrad. I actually had 2. What is the relationship, if you can quickly say, between West End Theater and the regional theater in the hinterlands out through the rest of the United Kingdom? And then the relationship between the performing arts academies and drama schools in the London area and the West End?
Yeah, with the regional areas in the hinterland, it's really going to depend on the level of theater. And some of those regional theaters all around the UK would prefer to be doing exactly what they're doing, and some aspire to move something towards the West End, and will from time to time do that. It all depends on producers sort of finding something and being around. But the UK has this great opportunity in festivals like the Fringe in August in Scotland, and then also the National Pantomime Festival, which happens in January, where theaters, large and small, gather all right there in Edinburgh, and then people can come in as producers or theater goers and really take a sampling of so many shows. And then a lot of times at the Fringe is where you can get option to take that next step, whether it's to do some Fringe in and around the West End and to do a test there, and then perhaps level up to the West End. This is what happened with Six the Musical, which we'll talk a little bit more about next time. And then, as I said, sometimes they simply prefer to kind of keep to themselves. Your second question was about the performing arts programs there. I was so impressed. So as I mentioned, my colleague, well, dear friend really, Natasha Dodsworth works at a performing arts college called Rose Bruford. And when I go with students in January, we go do an exchange with them. And it's so impressive. Their program, and their schooling system obviously is so very different from ours, but it's really those performing arts programs, particularly for the technical side, are very much hands-on training for the job you will have in a minute, right? And so they work very hard to maintain these connections to different theaters. So while we were there, she was checking in with students. When we would go see shows, she would check in with students who were working backstage on a West End show, or perhaps working backstage on a pantomime out way far out from the city in a small community venue. So they run the gamut, but I think they do a really nice job with their programs there of staying connected to what's going on. And when you talk to a producer, like when I was there, I was talking with the producer of Hamilton, and he was saying how much he really loves to work with the students coming through the pipeline from the performing arts programs, because it's easy to identify them. But for him, really, anytime a student comes up to him and says, "Hi, I understand you're a producer for West End Theaters, and I'm interested in getting into that," he says, "Great, let's go." Because just like I think in the States, anyone in theater really sees that no one got to where they are without having a hand to help them up. And so we're all eager to lend that hand down once you get to the top, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Karen. Barry, or I'm sorry, Joseph, you want to go ahead and unmute your mic, ask your question? I think Joseph wanted to be the first person to go the trip to London.
All right, Joseph,
Yes.
I'm putting you down now, Joseph. First.
This reminded me of a trip I took with Rockland Community College 25 years ago,
Oh,
where we
wow.
went to London in January for 2 weeks and saw 10 plays during that period. And of course,
Yes.
had all kinds of backstage activity and actually earned 3 college credits doing that.
Wow.
So when you speak about the trip and mentioning Mary, are you talking about an Ollie group trip, or we have to enroll into the school to take the trip with the students?
No, Joseph, I'm talking about an Ollie group trip.
All right.
I've done this trip a number of times with the Eckerd College students through the residential college. And then when I got back from my last one, Mary and I were talking. She's like, "Would you ever think about doing this for Ollie?" And I said, "Yeah, that'd be fantastic." So that's the plan. The timing
Okay.
is the only piece we don't know about.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a little follow-up to that, and Conrad, just stop me if I'm going on too long, because I can talk forever. But the class, usually when I take students, we schedule, whether we're going to New York or London, we schedule to see at least 5 shows in about a week's time or 10 days time. And then by the end of it, before we go, I teach them how to do all the day ticketing and how to get the really cheap tickets the day of and all of that. And by the end of it, they always double and end up seeing at least 10 shows. I'm always so impressed by how persistent they are at being a real audience member in the city. It's really fantastic.
Audrey, I see your mic is on. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, hi. Apropos of Jesus Christ Superstar, which I love that album and I've seen productions of. Today, on this day today, in 1970, the album by composer Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice was released today. So it's really interesting that you should mention that, because I read it in the newspaper, this is Globe and Mail, this morning. And sorry about the dog, she's seeing another dog outside. They said singing the titular role was Ian Gillan, the wild-voiced frontman of the British metal pioneers Deep Purple. And then Lloyd Webber says, Ian was a revelation, he tells Rolling Stone magazine. Once I heard his voice, I thought, my gosh, I can go so much further than I thought. So he sort of reimagined how he could do the performance based on this fabulous voice of Ian. So anyway, I just thought I'd put that in, because I was reading that this morning and I said, look, you're talking about it. And so that's why I knew to vote it was Jesus Christ Superstar. So
that's fantastic. Well, that's great. And it makes so much sense, because now most people who go to sing Jesus Christ Superstar are like, oh, it's next to impossible to sing. Like, it is a really, really hard song. The songs are just hard. And then the style is so unique. In fact, if you're ever looking for a really dynamic version of Jesus Christ Superstar, there's a version that was recorded in Germany in the 80s that is so phenomenal. And I think they really shift the music nicely so that the interpretations that they took there, they had all of these musicians from hair bands, from German hair bands in the 80s that ended up taking on the roles for Jesus Christ Superstar. And so they really knocked it out of the park with their approach, because they thought, well, we're really going to take on the rock side of things. I think now when people try to do Jesus Christ Superstar, some of the challenge that comes in is that the performers tend to be musical theater performers, and that's a different style of singing to rock music. And so there's a little bit of a clash of the worlds that has to happen to make it really sound exactly so. Thanks so much for sharing. I totally planned it that way, that we would do it on the anniversary today.
you're welcome. Right on.
Jean, if you see any questions in the Q&A or chat, I don't see any more hands raised. I think that may be all the questions we have for today, right, Jean? I think your mic is muted.
Sorry. If you have a question, you want to type it in, we can answer it next week when we start, or we can have you type it in next week. And we want to thank you for joining us on behalf of Ollie and Eckerd College. And we look forward to seeing you next Wednesday at 1:30 for part 2.
Great.
Yep.
See, everyone, thanks for joining us.
And thank you, Jessica, for a wonderful presentation.
My pleasure. It's so much fun.
And Audrey, if you can leave the name of your dog in the chat, I'm curious. Have a great afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Ollie Eckerd College, thank you, and have a great afternoon.